Hello, comrades. RJM3 here. This is the second part in my two-part special on the Soviet Union winning the Cold War. If you haven't seen part 1 already, I highly recommend you check it out before watching this video. If you already have, then let's not waste any more time and get right back into the scenario.
Okay, so picking up right where we left off in 1969, the Apollo 11 mission has just ended in disaster. Now, the main reason why the Soviets couldn't get out to the moon in our timeline was because they had trouble developing the N-1 rocket, the Soviet rocket designed to send a man to the moon. The N-1 rocket project began in 1965, but was underfunded and rushed. Both tests in 1969 ended in failure. After the US landed on the moon in our timeline, the project was finally cancelled in 1974. In this alternate timeline, the development of the N-1 begins earlier and is properly funded. After the Apollo 11 disaster, the Soviet Union is finally ready to send a man to the moon. August 1969, a Soviet module lands on the lunar surface. Alexei Leonov is the first man to walk on the moon. News of the landing is celebrated across the USSR. Meanwhile, the United States absolutely panics, worse than when the Soviets launched Sputnik. America still catches up with the Apollo 12 mission in November, but it's already over. The Soviet Union has won the space race. 1972. Because Richard Nixon never became president in this timeline, he never improves America's relations with Russia or China, and without Nixon's backing, General Augusto Pinochet never stages a coup to overthrow the Chilean government in 1973. So the good news is that Chile is never ruled by Pinochet's brutal regime, but the bad news is that the socialist policies of Chilean President Salvador Allende send Chile's economy down the toilet, and he establishes closer ties to the Soviet Union. 1976. Georgian Democrat Jimmy Carter is elected President of the United States. Just like in our timeline, the American economy is hit by high inflation and stagnation. But shit really hits the fan in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, the resultant hostage crisis, and the energy crisis. American morale was pretty low in the late 70s. And as if 1979 wasn't already an awful year, this alternate timeline only adds more fuel to the fire. Remember when I talked about Inajiro Asanuma surviving his assassination attempt back in part 1? Well, this is where that finally comes back. Over the past 19 years, Asanuma has been increasing support for the Japanese Socialist Party. In the 1979 Japanese election, the Socialists form a coalition with the Japanese Communist Party and win the election. Japan goes communist and America loses their last ally in East Asia. With East Asia firmly under Soviet influence, current Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev no longer sees the urgency in sending troops into Afghanistan to assist the local communist faction and doesn't send troops into the country, so the Soviet-Afghan War never happens, sparing the USSR a great depletion of resources and morale. The Soviet Union instead decides to divert finances to assist communist parties in Western Europe and Latin America. Going into the new decade, American morale continues to go on a downward trend due to the Russian ice hockey team beating the Americans in the 1980 Winter Olympics and not the other way around. At this point, independence movements in America start to gain traction. Now, the 1980s was the decade in our timeline and in this alternate timeline where the Cold War would near its end. The ending of the Cold War can be attributed to the actions of two men, US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. First, let's talk about Reagan. Ronald Reagan overwhelmingly defeated Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election. Upon entering office, he introduced his own variety of supply-side economics known as Reaganomics, lowering taxes and decreasing regulation. This policy resolved the economic problems plaguing America and caused the 1980s to be a period of economic growth. He also came up with the idea for SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative. SDI was a planned defense project comprised of laser-armed satellites among other defenses which would make America invulnerable to a nuclear attack, completely shattering the concept of mutually assured destruction. Now, granted, SDI was far too advanced to be made in the 1980s, or even in the present day, but it did scare the Soviets into excessive military spending, further wrecking their already stagnating economy. Reagan, of course, also met with Gorbachev on multiple occasions to talk diplomacy. but all of those accomplishments almost never happened. March 30th, 1981. As Reagan exits the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., John Hinckley Jr. opens fire. One of these bullets struck Reagan, but missed his heart by a single inch. Luckily, Reagan survived and went on to serve 2 full terms. But in this timeline, Reagan isn't so lucky. The bullet strikes him square in the heart, and he is later pronounced dead at the hospital. Before he can introduce Reaganomics, announce SDI, or ever meet Gorbachev, his presidency ends after only 69 days. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, is sworn in. The economic troubles from the late 70s continue long into the 80s. The Soviet Union never goes overboard with military spending, and tensions between the USA and the USSR never cool down. Now, let's move on to Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev rose to power in 1985. Now, what made him unique from all previous Soviet leaders was that he was an idealist. He saw how the Soviet economy was stagnating and how the people were suffering. He wanted to implement reform which would fix these problems, whilst upending the entire Soviet system. The 3 major reforms Gorbachev introduced were perestroika, glasnost, and demokratizatsiya. Perestroika, or restructuring, reshaped how the Soviet economy functioned, allowing a freer, more privatized market. Glasnost, or openness, allowed free speech and freedom of the press. Demokratizatsiya, or democratization, abolished the one-party system and allowed free elections where independent candidates could compete with the Communist Party. While Gorbachev hoped these reforms would save the USSR, they would ultimately become the final nail in the coffin. Implementing perestroika only created shortages and increased political, social, and economic tensions. Glasnost revealed the failure of communism to the Soviet public and exposed how morally bankrupt their government actually was. Because of this massive public relations failure, when independent candidates ran against the Communist Party thanks to demokratizatsiya, the Communists started to lose elections. Gorbachev also didn't like to use brute force against any opposition, and so he refused to do anything when Eastern European countries started to leave the Eastern Bloc or when the East Berliners tore down the Berlin Wall. In a last-ditched effort to save the dying Soviet Union, in 1991, communist hardliners overthrew and captured Gorbachev in a coup d'etat. The coup, however, failed when President-elect of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin, climbed on top of a tank in Moscow and called for a general strike from the public and the military against the conspirators until Gorbachev was released. Despite being freed, Gorbachev had no choice but to dissolve the USSR, as not doing so would likely lead to a civil war. On December 26, 1991, Gorbachev officially dissolved the Soviet Union, leading to the United States achieving global dominance. Now, in this alternate timeline, Gorbachev is a different kind of person. He has better foresight, leading him to realize that the previously mentioned reforms would ultimately fail. Instead, he decides to mimic the same plan which the Chinese used to fix their own economy back in the 70s. This alternate Gorbachev is also far less compassionate and more willing to crack down on dissidents in Eastern Europe.
Okay, I think we've created enough divergence points. Now let's see what happens next.
As the Soviet economy surpasses the American economy, the United States starts to fall apart, plagued by militant hippies, secessionist movements, and overall civil unrest. Thanks to the extra Soviet backing, the communist Sandinista movement in Nicaragua expands across Latin America, leading to a civil war in Mexico. America sends troops into Mexico to support the anti-communist faction, but this only ends up becoming another disastrous intervention. Greater disaster comes in 1987 when Soviet funding leads to communists winning national elections in France and Italy. American troops are eventually forced to withdraw from Mexico to deal with the increasing instability back home. President Bush declares martial law and cancels the 1988 presidential election. Despite Bush's best efforts to cool things down, the situation threatens to boil over into civil war. In 1991, Bush allows all the rioting secessionist states to leave, breaking up the United States. Several new nations emerge from the division of America. The People's Republic of California is established by the radical communist hippies that had been plaguing America for years. The Second Republic of Texas is founded by libertarians wanting nothing to do with the chaos consuming the rest of the country. The Republic of New England is created by socialists wanting to create more peaceful relations with the Soviet Union. The Theocracy of Deseret, formerly the state of Utah, now run by radical Mormons. Down south is the Republic of Florida, which left the Union because, well, it's Florida. Alaska and Hawaii were also given independence, but were immediately seized by the Soviets along with every American-controlled island in the Pacific. Finally, in the middle of it all is the remaining 36 states of the United States.
The Cold War is over. The United States is in pieces, and the Soviet Union reigns supreme. So what happens to the rest of the world?
Across the Atlantic, with America out of the picture, the Soviet Union is able to conquer its remaining enemies in Europe. The Warsaw Pact invades the remnants of NATO and Yugoslavia. East and West Germany are finally reunited, but under the East German government. A communist New World Order takes control of much of the globe. Billions of people spread across several continents are now living underneath authoritarian communist regimes. The Soviet Union becomes the world's global hegemon, having influence in every region. Europe is politically and economically united under the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, becoming autonomous from Russia. The EU-SSR is run by an elitist bureaucracy, actively seeking to erase Europe's history and culture while censoring all free speech and criticism through brute force and intimidation.
So not that different from Europe in our timeline.
The nations of East Asia continue to be loyal allies to Russia, though a rift with China is starting to show with their common enemy gone. Also, India goes communist after the Cold War. In Latin America, the local regimes aren't so stable. They are constantly plagued by dissidents and the worst famines. Troops from the Soviet Union and the UN are kept in the region to try to maintain order and stability. In North America, Canada goes communist, leaving the United States surrounded by Soviet allies. Despite this new world order, there is still one major power left defying the Soviets, the United Kingdom. While the rest of NATO was destroyed, Great Britain was spared, not just because they were separated from the mainland, but also because they had nuclear weapons. Britain establishes closer ties with the remaining Commonwealth of Nations, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Jamaica, just to name a few. The Commonwealth does all it can to impede the efforts by the Warsaw Pact to spread communism in the Third World. The UK doesn't even consider returning Hong Kong to the Chinese in this timeline. At the dawn of the new millennium, the image of Soviet dominance starts to crack. America begins to recover from the setbacks of the past 2 decades under new leadership. The US invades Deseret on the pretense of fighting Mormon extremism. In 2001, Islamic extremists bombed the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense. In retaliation, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to overthrow the people responsible. In 2003, the Soviet government accuses Iran of having involvement in the attacks and is also invaded. While the governments of both nations are toppled within months, extremist rebels continue to wage a guerrilla war on the Red Army, prolonging conflicts in the region for years. Russian involvement in the Middle East and North Africa only grows due to the Arab Spring. Meanwhile, America is put in an increasingly revanchist direction. In 2008, the United States invades Florida, over the latter getting closer to Cuba. The greatest act of American aggression happens in 2014, when the United States annexes the state of Connecticut from New England. This, combined with massive American remilitarization and the creation of an alliance with Texas, causes everyone else to freak out about the resurgent United States. Our scenario finally comes to an end in 2020. The Soviet Union is locked in seemingly endless wars in the Middle East and Latin America. The threat of China continues to grow. The Commonwealth has expanded influence across the southern half of Africa. Europe is cracking down harder on an increasingly restless population. North America is worrying about an increasingly antagonistic United States. The social unrest in Latin America has reached a boiling point, and the whole world is heading into an uncertain future.
And that's what would have happened if the Soviet Union won the Cold War. boy has this scenario been a lot of work. I guess since the Cold War was such a long conflict, I needed 2 whole videos to cover it all. Maybe for my next video, I should go easy on myself. Perhaps I should discuss a scenario about a much shorter conflict. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.